most egregious errors and failures of the United States and especially the NATO senior leaders at the political, diplomatic, and military level has been our confusion on the terms of strategy and tactics. We pay so much attention to tactics, and our mentality is just wired to think about what's happening right now and looking at what's right in front of you and talking so much about that. The media, of course, we're locked into that as well. You know, the 24-hour media cycle, oftentimes, hey, something's trending for like a number of hours, and then they're off the table, and then we're ready to move on to next and swapping next on our screen. So we're kind of wired that way. And in some ways, it's not necessarily a bad thing. In some places, it's even useful. Not when you come to war and peace, however, because what I'm going to show you right now is that while the West has been playing tactics, Russia has been playing strategy. And the West has been unwilling to acknowledge reality and understand how tactics are necessary to achieve a strategic outcome beneficial to your side, while the Russian side does. And we're now closing in on what could be the end game to where all of these things could come together to where reality will impose itself an outcome that doesn't matter whether you focus on the near term or the long term. The things are going to play out the way that they always have in human affairs. Now, right now, the war is entering an alarming phase. You have Ukraine having recently launched an incursion into Russia, and lots of civilians have been killed. Lots of civilian villages have been destroyed or burned. And then here in the last few days, even, you've had an attack by Ukraine into Belgorod city, actually just last night their time. And also the Russians have attacked at the Kharkiv city. And in both those cases, like you're seeing here, this one you're watching right here, if you haven't seen it yet, this is in Belgorod city. This is a Russian city. And you see that there are obviously no military targets here. They're just hitting civilian cars on the road. I've also seen some other, you can see those bombs in the distance going off there. This just flat out hitting the city. And those images that Gary showed right before that of Kharkiv in the Ukraine side was also an apartment complex, and just lots of civilians are getting killed on both sides. So what this is doing is it's making the populations on both sides more and more angry, and the leaders, especially on the Western side, more and more desperate and much more willing to take risks, even reckless ones. And we're seeing that play out all over the place. But that's the current situation. That's not how this started, though, or that's not unique to now, especially on the U.S. side. We have been focused on the tactics of this all the way from the beginning. And like I said, Russia has been focused on strategy. That means that the U.S. and the Ukraine side has been unwilling to make hard decisions, things that are necessary. And anyone who's looking at things from a strategic point of view would have understood. Whereas the Russians have been willing to make some really hard decisions tactically that appear to be losing positions in the tactics. And certainly that's the way it would appeared. But the ultimate objective, which is to win the war for either side and have it concluded on terms beneficial to them on a political side, is definitely in Russia's favor. And we may be in the end game to where very soon that is exactly how it's going to play out, no matter what we want. And we definitely don't want that in the United States and in Kiev and in the Western Europe, as you're going to see here shortly. But first of all, let's take a step back. I want to look at things at the 30,000 foot level. I want to look at things in the big picture and from the course of the whole war all the way up through now, hitting a number of key places to where these twin tendencies, one towards tactics, one towards strategy, have been playing out and what the consequence of those are. This is crucial for understanding why the war is where it is today. Now, I want to start off, first of all, on the Russian side. So in February 2022, Russia attacked into Ukraine in basically what I call was their first major blunder on really all three levels, on the tactical, the operational, and the strategic level. They made a huge error, and they made a big gamble. I mean, it was a gamble. It had some plausibility, but the problem is that they were not prepared for what comes next if plan A doesn't work. Their plan A, as you can see on the map right there, was to have two twin arrows basically coming in towards Kiev in the north, and then another one coming in the Sumy area, then the Donetsk area, the Donbass, and then coming in from Crimea from the south. And so for those four general directions, Kiev, Sumy, the Donbass, and the Crimea, the intent was to swarm the Ukraine side, to overwhelm them with firepower so that they would see that, man, everybody can look at the map and see that Russia is, whatever it is, 7, 8, 10 times bigger than Ukraine, and all of their capacity. There are millions more military age fighting males, and come to the what Putin must have thought was the logical conclusion. Resistance is foolish and it can only end in defeat. So why fight a war you can't win? Let's just capitulate and then have a negotiated settlement. That's what Putin had desired. He said so many times. He said before the war started. He said immediately after it started. They, again, thought they had a negotiated settlement in March, April of 2022. Before that fell apart. We'll discuss that another time. But the bottom line is that Russia thought that was their plan A, and they thought it would work. The problem for them was they had no plan B. They had no resources for plan B. So when Zelensky didn't play his part and didn't capitulate, as had happened during the Soviet times, the 1956 invasion into Hungary, or the 1968, I think it was, Soviet invasion into Czechoslovakia, those things didn't work out because those were both short little skirmishes. The leaders of both sides made those calculations and then made those political decisions. That didn't happen this time. So Russia got caught with its pants down because, oh crap, we can't fight a war with what we had. I think that in the initial phase, less than 100,000 troops actually entered Ukrainian territory, with some of them staying on the Russian side for reserves. And so, you know, Gary, throw that first map back up there if you could. You can see here, when you're talking about spreading your forces out over all of these terrains and all this territory in the country of Ukraine, that any single arrow is not going to have that many troops. And so this idea that Russia wanted to militarily capture Kiev in the early phases is belied by the number of troops that they had allocated for that purpose. Had they intended to militarily capture Kiev, they wouldn't have split their forces into four parts throughout the country. They would have massed them all in that one area, and then they would have conducted their tactics in a very different way. But what they wanted to do was be ready to fight, but that hopefully they wouldn't have to. Or all they would have to do is, show a few, fire a bunch of tank rounds, blow up a couple of villages and kill some troops on the Ukraine side. And then they would, come to the logical conclusion. When that didn't happen, now then they're in a huge, huge bind because Ukraine fought tenaciously. They fought courageously. And especially because a lot of the anti-tank weapons that they had at the time, they, in a sense, were fighting an insurgent battle at the time by doing hit and run tactics and hitting these long Russian columns in the rear and the flanks and then disappearing out. So it wasn't, any kind of big aero movements or big military movements. It was just disrupting everything the Russians were doing. And because they were not equipped or prepared for that kind of fight, they really did suffer some losses. And this is where you're starting to see the first movements of the Russian side on strategy. So when it became clear that Russia could not continue with the forces it had at hand or the forces it could muster, could not basically enact a plan B, they have to figure one out. Well, in the meantime, it was always clear from the beginning that the Donbass in the east was definitely the priority of effort. It always was. That was even what was cited as the reason why Russia came in, was to protect the Russian speakers in the Donbass area, which, of course, they had been fighting a civil war since 2014. And so they overtly came in on their side. That was one of the four arrows that they came in there. So instead of they tried to figure out what to do. They thought, well, what we're going to do initially is we're going to take the troops in the north, especially in the Kiev area. We're going to withdraw them from that area and move them into the Donbass. Now, they tried to cover this over by saying, well, we just did it as a fact of goodwill so that we could show we actually want to reach a negotiated settlement. Maybe that was part of the deal, but I assure you the majority of it was militarily. You don't have the troops to go here. They were starting to just getting picked off one by one. They didn't have enough to even provide their local security, much less to win a military victory. So they withdrew them completely by March, I believe it was, and moved them to the east to join the Donbass area where they had strength in numbers while they could start figuring things out. And you may remember some of the video from when Soviets or the Russians withdrew from Kiev. Americans had an interesting reaction. Watch this.
A U.S. military official tells NBC News all Russian troops have left the region. The Russians came, they killed, they retreated, withdrawing back to Belarus and Russia for repairs. The Pentagon sounding upbeat about Ukraine's chances.
The proof is literally in the outcomes that you're seeing every day. Absolutely, they can win.
And, you know, it's ironic because that's what Kirby was saying then. That was, I think it said April of 2022. But prior to that, you had Biden saying, don't do this to Putin. You know, it's coming. But he said, look, everybody knows Russia's a much bigger country. They have a much bigger military. You had many in the senior military officials saying that they thought that Ukraine could fall. You may recall that famous comment by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Milley, who said he thought that Kiev would fall within 72 hours. That's what we said. Obviously, the government believed that because you may also recall that we moved all of our diplomatic forces out of Kiev and farther to the west inside of Ukraine, because we also thought that's what was going to happen. And then when it didn't happen, we were all, the government was all, and I do put myself into that category. I was also surprised that Russia, after just a few weeks of attempts, withdrew and pulled back as opposed to reinforcing that. So I also initially missed the initial objective of the operation. If it had been to take Kiev, then they would have moved troops from the Donbass area, and from the south, they would have moved them up to the front or moved some others, and then they would have actually pressed on. But they never made a concerted effort to militarily take the city of Kiev. And so that's where they exposed what their real priority was. They withdrew their troops. Some of them they did put back into Russia and Belarus for repair, like you mentioned, but the majority of those who were not damaged went into the Donbass, and that's where most of the fighting then took place there. Then all of a sudden, as 2022 goes on, and Russia's trying to figure out what they're going to do, because let me just tell you, things at the strategic level move a lot slower than they do at the tactical level, which is why the West has such a problem with it, because it doesn't correspond to media cycles. It doesn't correspond into the way our brains are wired and how we want to swap after 24 hours and move on to what's next. And so it's going to take time for Russia to first figure out, okay, now then we're forced with the plan B. What is our objective? What do we want to accomplish? Then they have to, whatever they come up with, they have to then say, now how are we going to resource it? Because we were not set up, industrial or any other way, for a long sustained war that was going to take on the whole country. They didn't plan for that. They had no intention to do that, and they certainly didn't think it was going to happen. Now it is thrust upon them, and so now they're going to try to figure it out. Well, Ukraine, again, recognized that Russia didn't have as many troops as they needed to conduct even these limited operations now, and especially in the northern part, in the Kharkiv area, first of all. You had this movement by Ukraine's side, and General Sursky was actually the guy in charge of this particular part of it, one of his big early successes, and he massed a bunch of troops in the Kharkiv area, unbeknownst to Russia. They weren't able to discover it, and also they went on this big sweeping attack and took Kharkiv. Gary, if you can put that full screen up there. Yeah, and this was one of the bigger success stories of Ukraine in 2022, the first really big one, where they basically retook a total of about 6,000 square kilometers of territory. It sounds much more impressive than it was, because Russia was very, very thinly equipped in the Kharkiv area. They had withdrawn from Sumy and Kiev, as I pointed out there, but they had not withdrawn from the Kharkiv area. That was another tactical error on the Russian side earlier, because they didn't have enough troops to hold it. They had only their version of the National Guard troops, which were lightly armed and minimally trained. They had not made any defensive positions. So I think this was in, I can't remember which month it was, April or May, or maybe even later than that in the year in 2022. I can't remember, but the Russians had taken no effort to build defenses. They had not dug anything in. They had not prepared anything. So again, they were caught unprepared because they didn't think it would happen. That's going to be fixed. They're going to learn a lesson from this time. But that was the case then. So no matter whether Russia was lightly defended or not, it was a huge success tactically and operationally for the Ukraine side, and definitely media-wise, because it just galvanized support across Western Europe, because now then they think, Russia can be beat, they can be driven out. And that's what set the stage for all of this stuff coming in from the West, and all these thousands of combat vehicles, millions of rounds of ammunition, missiles, anti-tank missiles, anti-air missiles, etc. everything starts coming in there, and there's all this enthusiasm to get behind the Ukraine side. That was bolstered even more in the fall of 2022 when the new general came in, Surovikin, who did an initial assessment and came to a hard decision. He was faced at the time in the Kherson region, which Russia had illegally annexed prior to that. So they're now calling it Russian territory. And the Ukraine side had been massing troops for an attack there. And that actually started initially, I want to say it was April or May. I'm sorry, August or September of 2022. And initially it was having terrible success or terrible results. The Ukraine side was losing lots and lots of people, and they were making incremental gains, but not that many. And it was a lot of trouble, a lot of casualties, but they were methodical. They just continued on because at that time they actually had the troops to keep throwing in there. Surovikin looked at the map and he said, okay, we have the Dnieper River, the Dnipro in that portion of the country with their backs to it. There's one main bridge upon that the Ukraine side had already significantly disabled and making it very, very difficult for Russia to keep its troops supplied there. It was one of the very few crossing points available. And so the Russians were faced with, do we hang on to Kherson City? Because that was the first and so thus far only major city they had conquered and held. Do they hold on to that when the supply line is going to be difficult? Or do they withdraw from there, get it back on the other side of the river, and then set up new lines of defenses? Now, certainly conventional wisdom in the West is that you don't give up any territory. If the enemy takes it with a fight, that's one thing, but you don't give it up. The Russians looked at things differently. And here's where it really starts to kick in, that they were looking strategically. Their objective is to win the war, not to win a specific battle. So Surovikin made the very, very difficult choice that was mocked and ridiculed at the time in the West when he said this.
Всесторонне оценив сложившуюся ситуацию, предлагается занять оборону по левому берегу реки Днепр. Понимаю, что это очень непростое решение. В то же время мы сохраним самое главное – жизни наших военнослужащих и в целом боеспособность группировки войск, держать которую на правом берегу.
Now, that was pretty remarkable at the time because that's not some secret meeting in the Kremlin that they had. That was actually broadcast in public in Russia, and then, of course, subsequently sent to the West. And it was just euphoria because they're saying, okay, you just got driven out of Kharkiv, the whole northern part of the region, and now then you're willingly surrendering everything on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River down there to include the entirety of the city of Kherson. And the Russian forces completely withdrew. And Zelensky, you may recall, had a big photo op right after that. That was as predictable as the sun coming up in the morning. And certainly he did. And it had the cameras rolling and all these things that they said, this is another major victory. And it was, a shame and humiliation for the Russian side. Here's the problem. At least problem for the West, as I identified even at the time. And anybody who's willing to look at just the facts as they are unemotionally and just seeing what's happening, recognize that this was actually a smart move for the Russian side and something that you're going to have not seen in the Ukraine side subsequent to this. More on that in a second. By withdrawing from that area, Russia had about 40,000 troops in that area, which they withdrew in order almost without any loss at all as they withdrew back across the river. Then they did the smart thing. They blew the remainder of that one bridge and then 3 others. So there were 4 bridges across that whole southern region of the front that they blew. And so now then, unless you want to mount a big pontoon bridge offensive, which takes enormous amounts of planning and resources, that whole then section of the front is now sealed off. The whole section. So Russia is no longer threatened by a Ukrainian incursion, like to follow them up, for example, across. So they put minimal troops on the eastern side of that river to defend against any potential incursions that may come across. But now then they move the majority of their troops back up into the Donbass where their priority of effort was. And we're going to see that was one of the big, big advantages. Second to that, following that, Surovikin again, he then immediately began digging defensive lines. And so Russia made the decision, it's subsequently now clear, that they were going to spend the bulk of the following year, 2023, in the defensive while they built up their forces and while they built up their defense industrial capacity in Russia. So Russia was willing to spend a whole year just defending while they're getting ready elsewhere. And that's exactly what they did. So the what was later became known as the Surovikin lines, the defensive positions, which Russia built, there were in many areas 5 layers of defensive belts, which would have defended, which would have made an offensive very, very difficult. But because of all the euphoria in the West, they absolutely said, we are for sure going on the offensive in 2023. And as Zelensky said on that full screen that Gary put up a second ago, we will succeed, Zelensky says. Ukraine is ready to launch counteroffensive. That was in early 2023. So now, because they're bolstered, they have gotten all this support from the West, especially the United States. They're getting billions of dollars, thousands of combat vehicles of various types, some of the most modern armor, the HIMARS system, our artillery system, our tanks, intelligence capabilities, training from NATO, all these things, everything focusing on a decisive late spring or early summer offensive, as it turned out. Now, Zelensky was saying at the time, this is what we're going to do. We're definitely going to succeed. And certainly everybody in the West was cheerleading along with that. But again, we go back to, if you're looking at things cold and sober, it was not a pretty picture. And at the time, actually a month before Zelensky made that, I actually wrote this piece in the publication 1945, where I argued that no, will Ukraine's spring offensive bring Kiev victory or set the stage for its defeat? In that article, I wrote that ignoring the balance of power that strongly favors Russia while hoping that Ukraine can muster the required strength to win a decisive victory in the battlefield while refusing any consideration of a negotiated settlement could ultimately lay the foundation for a much steeper cost to Kiev to end the fighting and on terms more favorable to Moscow. And frankly, that was kind of being nice about it, because the chances of Ukraine winning were not even that good. And as we're seeing, it's playing out exactly that way. So what I warned about in the spring of 2023 is now graphically upon us here. And as we're going to see in a minute, that still hasn't dawned on our leaders. We still don't see what's right in front of our eyes, while the Russian side does. And I'm afraid this is going to end really badly for our side. But so you had the Ukraine side saying, okay, we're going to continue to fight here and we're going to win, despite what all the fundamentals say. And as we all know, it didn't. The 2023 offensive was a complete and utter disaster. And it was as predictable as the sun coming up in the morning. Because here's why. And in subsequent articles, I also published before the offensive too, where I said, look, Russia has near dominance in the air. They have a functioning Air Force that is risk averse. And so it doesn't hardly fly over the battlefield, only rarely, but it flies out beyond the line of capability of the Ukraine side in the Russian side. And then they have these long range air to ground missiles that they can fire with complete impunity. And the Ukraine side doesn't have the Air Force to be able to knock them down. They don't have the air defense, the Ukraine side didn't, to defend against the missiles or the drones in sufficient quantities. They didn't have the engineering equipment anywhere near what they needed to try and penetrate dug-in defensive positions that were ultra modern that the Russian side had built. They didn't have enough manpower. And possibly most importantly of all, they didn't have the capacity in the armored vehicles to be able to penetrate these lines. I used to be the second in command of an armored cavalry squadron for the 1st Armored Division in Germany in the early 2000s. And much of our task and training at that time in European terrain and in Germany there was to train on doing exactly that, how to penetrate a Soviet-style dug-in defense position. So I knew exactly what it would take, and I knew how much resources you had to have, and I knew the level of training you had to have, the equipment and the systems, as important as anything else. We needed systems that were with maintenance, with supply, with medical support, all of these kinds of things to be able to penetrate through there. You had to have Army, you had to have engineering support, you had to have air support, you had to have rotary and fixed wing support, all of those things, air defense, everything is necessary to do the really, really hard job of penetrating those defensive lines. Ukraine had almost none of them. Now, they had lots of tanks and personnel, armor personnel carriers and artillery pieces at the time, and they had a lot of people. But what they didn't have was all the other things that go along with it. And the Russian side had the things that they need to defend. And that's exactly how it turned out. Of course, It should have been painfully evident to anyone who's willing to look that that's how it was going to work out. And as it turned out, that not only did they not penetrate the 5 lines to get to the Azov coast, which was the stated objective, they got to one part of the first line of the main belt of defense of the Surovikin lines and broke their teeth on it. And they never penetrated beyond that in that area. And that just set the stage for everything else. But now then you have the next level of problems that the Ukraine side said, okay, well, we're going to keep defending what we have and we're going to get ready for another offensive. We'll try again next year. That was their comment. But now then the Russian side, because they have waited all this time and now they've inflicted this military defeat from the defensive side on the attacking, now then they're ready because they have been building up their troops. They have been training them out of contact, gaining new information along the lines. They're learning more things about drone warfare of their own because they were on the lower edge of that ledger at the beginning. Now then they're increasing their electronic warfare capability, which was always pretty good, and now it's getting really good. And they're starting to have their industrial capacity ramp up. So now then they're getting, tactical missiles, theater missiles, artillery shells. Of course, they make deals eventually with Iran to get more drones, with North Korea to get both missiles and other kinds of support, especially artillery shells. So things are really ramping up on the Russian side. And so Russia starts then a very methodical, even before the end of 23, on a whole offensive pressure along the 600-mile line of contact in the east, the Eastern Front. And we come up to the place of Bakhmut, where Russia starts trying to push against that. And they spend a total of 9 months trying to take that. And this is one of the first major errors of the Ukraine side, aside from trying an offensive that had no chance. Now then they're compounding that by they're going to defend this city of Bakhmut at all cases because of its what they consider importance media-wise. They don't want to give that city up. Zelensky doesn't want to give the city up. So instead of saying, all right, militarily it's compromised, so we should withdraw our forces back to the next prepared line of defenses and reestablish it here. Let me explain what should have happened at that point and why it was so critical and important that it failed. What they should have done was categorically similar to what Surovikin had done. It was embarrassing for Russia that he was humiliated and laughed at in public by the West, and of course Russia in the media sphere took a big hit because of that. But as I pointed out a minute ago, militarily that was a good deal. That set the stage for Russia to continue to fight effectively and allow them the time they needed to build the resources and the manpower capacity to do what now they're starting to do here. That's what Ukraine should have done. Militarily, how this works, you have a city here and it's got certain defensive, and especially if you've established defensive works within that city, and you have the terrain to your advantage where you have high ground, so the enemy would have to come across open ground and they would have to fight uphill. And there's not any natural barriers for them to hide behind, so that the cost and of trying to advance over even 100 meters would be very high. They had that initially with Bakhmut, but over time, over months, Russia began to just eat away at that. And then they got to a position to where now then they didn't have to advance over large open spaces because they had the territory. Once that happened and they got within basically direct fire range of the city, it was until the end was foreordained. So what Ukraine should have done was taken there, I think it was around 10 to 20,000 troops, depending on what day it was, in there, withdrew them under cover of night, conducted a fighting withdrawal, as the Russians had done when they left Kherson City, and gone to the next defensive position. And of course, all the while, they should be building more lines of defense with the expectation that they may have to fall back to additional lines. That's what they should have done. What they did instead was saying, nope, we are not going to give that up. Not 1 inch, not 1 meter of territory are we going to just let Russia have. So instead of withdrawing those 10,000, they kept putting more in. So even when Russia then got into the city, into the eastern half of that, they started moving further and further in Bakhmut. Again, the rational, the logical, the necessary thing to do militarily would have been to withdraw to the next line of defense. And there was another line of defense. They could have moved back to area where they had advantages, where, again, they had a large open area where Russia would have to go across, that would make it easy for the defense. There was some natural lines of defense a little bit further to the west. It was available. They could have done this. It was the smart thing to do militarily, but they didn't want to do the smart thing. They wanted to hang on. Now, I get it. You don't want to lose. You don't want to lose the city. But when militarily the fundamentals are now no longer in your favor, and it's just a matter of time before the Russian side wins, that's exactly what happened. And of course, we know it played out. There was, I think that by some estimates, there were 70 to 80,000 Ukrainians killed defending the pointless defense of the attempted defense of Bakhmut, and they moved through. Now, a lot of people say, yeah, but Russia also lost a lot. That's not entirely accurate. Number one, the losses on the Russian side were substantial, but they were not equivalent to what the Ukraine lost. And it was the Wagner group that took that did almost all the fighting. While on the rest of the line, Russia was basically kind of holding the line while they were continuing to build forces elsewhere and to train forces elsewhere, et cetera. So they were using this as a holding situation, but they were using the Wagner group to crush the Ukraine side there. So they lost so many well-trained troops and people that they needed to continue fighting elsewhere. This was then repeated in Avdiivka. Months later, the same dynamics were at play and the same situation occurred. And the Ukraine side did the same thing in response. They held on to the city as long as possible. They didn't withdraw when military expediency required it. And again, they lost tens of thousands of people. And you can't keep losing that many people when things are not working in your favor and there is more advantageous terrain for it. It's the classic thing of trading terrain for time. And you also, not just time, but also you preserve your fighting force so that you make the subsequent advances by the enemy even more expensive. So whatever Russia lost taking Bakhmut, they would have lost almost certainly more had the Ukraine side just withdrawn to the previous one. And of course, just look, as it worked out, they lost Bakhmut. But did that cause the war to end? Then they lost Avdiivka. Did that cause the war to end? No. So instead of doing the right thing and preserving forces, they lost them anyway, and they lost the troops that went along with it. That's focusing on tactics of the moment and the perceived fear of what it would look like media-wise if you lost a certain thing. And it's just so perverse when you realize that they did everything wrong. They lost tactically and they lost media-wise. That's not the end of that story, unfortunately. So that's kind of where we are. That's where we have been up to this point. And now then Russia is getting prepared, and they have been increasing their offensive all along the Eastern Front now. And of course, after they'd lost Avdiivka, then the Russians now, all of that time they had been buying is now paying off because now then they're pushing even further along the west and more deeper into Ukrainian territory, and to the point to where it's becoming evident that if Russia comes with a big push, the weakening of the entire Ukrainian army could result in breaking through at some point, and then the entire thing could collapse. So now then, Ukraine is faced at this point. This is let's say that earlier middle of this summer, they come to another decision point. They should be able to look and just see at the fundamentals at play. They should be able to look at their side, what's coming from the west, what's not coming from the west, their manpower problem and how they're having a terrible time mobilizing anyone to fight. They don't have enough to offset losses. They see on the Russian side, they're still recruiting people at the rate of 30 to 40,000 per month, and they're willing to fight for that. And of course, the defense industrial capacity is just off the charts now, especially when you add in Iran and North Korea providing ammunition of various calibers. There's no way you could win. So what they should have done again is saying, all right, let's come up with the best negotiated settlement we can. And by June, Putin offered one last, as it probably turned out, opportunity for a negotiated settlement, which was on bad terms. It was worse than what was offered during the Minsk agreements, worse than what was offered in December 2021, worse than what was offered at Istanbul in 2022, and worse than had been talked apparently secretly earlier in 2024. It was the worst, but it was still going to leave Ukraine intact. It was still going to leave them with Odessa, with Kharkiv, with Kiev, all of the territories there, except for those 4 oblasts in Crimea. So from their perspective in Zelensky, that's not a good deal, but it's probably the best that you can. In fact, I won't even say probably. That was the best that you're going to get right there, because Russia has the capacity to conquer militarily, even if it takes a long time, although it may not. That remains to be seen. But instead of acknowledging those realities and taking the rational, sane course of action, Zelensky decided to do something different, and he attacked into Kursk area. And so now then you have this incursion in there. And again, because the West, being how they are, says, yeah, this is a great deal. This is cool. Shows that we're taking the fight to the Russians. We're showing them, sending a message that they're going to hurt with this war too. Somehow, I don't even know if they did the thought process through of that, yeah, we're going to punch a hole in a piece of the border with Russia, and that they're just going to surrender. And that they're just going to, or that they're going to pull troops off of the Eastern Front and move them, up to try to take care of the Kursk area. Although even then, even if Russia had done that, it would have been a temporary expediency. And once this had taken care of, they would have moved them back. And so you net would have gained nothing, except you lost a lot of troops in the process here. As it turned out, Russia did not do that. They maintained their focus on the primary objective, and they said, we're going to send some of our lower capable units to deal with this issue into Kharkiv and into the Kursk area, and we're going to slowly move that back, and we're going to be casualty producing attacks with artillery, rockets, drones, etc., and just pulverize those people there who are now contained and can't go anywhere else. And because they didn't have those troops available in the east, now all of a sudden that's starting to crumble at a really rapid pace. Russia is now making advances all across the line, which I'm going to show you here in a second, that puts the Ukraine side in real danger of collapsing in the entire Eastern Front. It's hard to imagine after so much this war for 2.5 years has had not a lot of movement, but now then that's starting to be the real risk here. And now then we're going to get back again to how it's not just Zelensky who has these delusionary ideas and this unwillingness to look at reality. You still have the United States. Here's what Kirby said just a few days ago.
We condemn in the strongest possible terms Russia's continued war against Ukraine and its efforts to plunge the Ukrainian people into darkness. As the fall here sits upon us and as winter approaches, as the president has said, Russia will never succeed in Ukraine, and the spirit of the Ukrainian people will never be broken. We're going to continue to lead that coalition of more than 50 countries in providing much needed military equipment for Ukraine. That certainly includes air defense systems and interceptors, which proved so critical in helping defend Ukraine against these attacks, and they need them every day.
Wow, it's hard for me to hear that kind of stuff because all that Kirby's saying there are bumper stickers. It's made for TV moments. It does not address the tactical situation. He didn't say anything in there that, well, Ukraine can still win as long as they do this tactical action, stop this, and then they have this offensive that they can then turn back around to start pushing Russia out of areas or whatever. He just said the will of the Ukrainian people will never be broken. Well, listen, that briefs well, but when you're talking about real people, not just a bumper sticker, what you're doing is saying, yes, their will may still be intact, but if you don't have the capacity to make good on their will, what you're doing by supporting it is condemning those very people to death. And that's what we've seen so far. There are probably hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men who have already paid the ultimate sacrifice for nothing because their leaders are taking terrible decisions. They're focusing on tactics at the expense of strategy. And yeah, when Ukraine made this penetration into Kursk, it gave them a big media bump. It gave them a lot of motivation and lots of memes that were sent out against Putin. A lot of people were happy for the moment inside of Kiev. But now what? Now what's going to happen? So now then the offensive has already petered out. The offensive movement there, they are contained. And now then Russia is starting to methodically move that line back. Ukraine doesn't have the manpower to continue feeding more and more people in there. Russians, whether it was intentional or not, and there's some debate on whether Russia actually allowed this incursion to take place, but regardless, once it did take place, they said, we're not going to be in a hurry here. We're going to contain it so it can't go out. And they literally dug defensive lines. We have satellite imagery to show. They literally dug defensive lines and basically sealed it off so that there was no possibility that Ukraine could. And now then they're just slowly moving it down, creating it like a new Bakhmut, a new Avdiivka, to where the Ukraine side keeps feeding in all these reserves, making sure they're not available anywhere to the east. And so Russia, who did not move any main combat areas, troops off of those areas, move them further, continue to move further to the west on the Eastern Front. and methodically work down these troops here. So now then, not only did Ukraine lose the troops, they lost enormous amounts of equipment, by many accounts, hundreds of combat vehicles that are now no longer going to be in use, and their supply overall, the entire theater is now dwindling. So it's going to be harder even to get their infantry troops up to the front lines in a protected means, because they just don't have that many anymore. Russia has no shortage of it. They've even been pulling out a lot of these older vehicles that they've had in storage from the 60s and 70s, and they get mocked for a lot of that, but they got them. And so they can continue to move troops up in there. No matter how many losses they have, there's no shortage. There's probably tens of thousands of vehicles that they can bring back up to operational capacity and have the ammunition and weapons and fuel for. They can just keep going in, and the Ukraine side is now running out. Whether they're modern or old, they're running out of all of it. So again, you're at the point of where militarily you just can't keep going on like this, but that hasn't affected Zelensky. And in fact, here's what he said just a couple of days ago.
I will present this plan to the President of the US. The success of this plan depends on him. Will they give what we have in this plan or not? Will we be free to use what we have in this plan or not?
That was a press conference he gave in Kiev, where he's basically saying that, hey, I'm going to go to the United States in September, and I've got this big wish list of things that I want. And, whether we succeed or not depends on the United States. So he's trying to put pressure on the Biden administration to say, hey, if we fail, it's your fault. And certainly there are plenty who wants to get behind that and will agree with that to put pressure on Biden to give it to him. But here's the mind-boggling thing. Don't just hear that press conference and that statement in isolation. Look at it back at the 30,000-foot level. That's nearly the same thing that was said in late 2022. Give me all this stuff, we'll have this offensive and we'll win. And you saw that we did. We gave them almost everything that they asked for in enormous quantities. And this nonsense that the Biden administration has not given the Ukraine side what they need is just nonsense when you look at the list of what we gave them. I mean, it's enormous. Thousands of American combat vehicles, millions of rounds of ammunition, et cetera. That's not the reason that they haven't been successful. The reason they hadn't been successful is because of the strategic balance. And if anyone's willing to look at it, you see it don't matter what we give them. We can give them all kinds of stuff here. Zelensky could go to Washington and Biden could say, okay, just give me your shopping list and whatever's on it, I'm going to give it to you as fast as we can get it over there. It's not going to make any difference. It will not make any difference because that's not what wins or loses war. Yes, you have to have combat equipment, but you also have to have the trained men to use them, and you have to have the systems that will maintain and keep those operational vehicles going in when you start fighting. And they got none of that. You see already that the air defense is just almost completely exhausted. Everything that we've given them to include our Patriots, our NASMs, the IRIS-T systems, all these things, they keep getting blown up, and there's not enough of them to give anyway. So those things haven't mattered. And yet they still want to keep talking like if I just get more stuff, then this is going to be. Now, just think of how irrational it is. Take the emotion out for a moment. How irrational it is to suggest that when you had every advantage and time in the world, and Russia had just suffered two big tactical setbacks in Kherson and Kharkiv in 2022, and then you got everything in the world from the West that you had wanted except for aircraft, and that you weren't successful. And now then, after all of that fighting and all the cities that you've lost but sin, and now all the advantage and the increasing that the Russian side has had, and it's moving forward further and further to the west, your army is literally at the critical stage where it could break at any time. And you want to hold out that, no, if I just get more stuff, it's going to work. And of course, you know that the F-16s were always the thing. Well, we just needed more air power. Look, they had an air force that was never effective from the beginning because of Russia's air defense capability and Russia's anti-air capability from their air force, flying from a safe distance in the Russian side. They got 1,000 fourth and fifth generation fighters and bombers on the Russian side. They've lost a handful of them, maybe 100, maybe a little bit more than that, but they still have 800 or 900 of them. And the Ukraine side has a handful of a score or so of them, but they can't fly anywhere near the front line or they get shot down. And that obviously includes F-16s. So F-16s were never a magic thing. They have some now. They have the ATACMS. They have the HIMARS. They have the Storm Shadow missiles. All these things that they wanted and they said would make a difference. They ended up getting, and it still hasn't made a difference. It was the $61 billion package earlier this year. That's the thing. If we just gave them that $61 billion package, that would be the ticket. And the claim at the time was, sure, We didn't give them that 61 billion in time. And so that cost Avdiivka. That's the new stab in the back narrative. The delay in that caused the loss of Avdiivka. Okay, there's not a lot of fundamentals there, but I'll just give you that for the sake of argument. What happened once that $61 billion was passed and the money and the equipment started flowing? Nada. Nothing happened. It didn't change anything. It didn't slow down the Russians. It had no effect whatsoever. And you keep seeing that common theme over and over. We just need another package. We just need another amount of equipment here. No, you don't. Look at this rationally. If you love Ukraine, if you're on the Ukraine side and you want them to succeed, if you want them to live, then it's time to do something different. But you're not going to see that. It's not going to happen because instead of what the U.S. is allegedly these smart guys and these former generals who can have all this experience that can tell things that what should be on paper great advice and instead is hideous advice. Let me show you just how hideous. Here's what General Jack Keane, one of the guys that runs the Institute for the Study of War, here's his great advice he gave just days ago.
What the Ukrainians want to do is punish Russia as much as possible, take as much territory as they possibly can, prevent Russia from taking more territory in the Donbass region, and go into negotiations next year in the best possible position. And as long as the administration keeps stalling and protracting the war, and that's what restricting the use of U.S. weapons in the Ukrainians' hands is actually doing, slowing down Ukrainians' efforts to be able to gain leverage over the Russians, makes no sense militarily, makes no sense politically.
Makes no sense. What makes no sense is everything you said before that sentence, Mr. Keene. That makes no sense at all. You're literally ignoring everything we've been talking about in this video from the beginning up to this now. Ignoring it entirely as though it didn't exist. Ignoring entirely the military fundamentals that told people like me and several others all along the way that this had no chance. The things that I wrote in 2022, in 2023 are playing out exactly as I wrote them ahead of time. Not because I'm some brilliant, person who can see into the future, but because I just look at things as they are. I look at the military fundamentals. I know military history and I know what equipment can and can't do. I know what soldiers can and can't do. And if the balance was just like this, you could make an argument, well, political will and the will of the fighting force on the lower side can, in good case, upset the taller one. We've seen that in history before where a superior force was defeated by an inferior force. That's possible. But when it's like this, it's not possible. And if you keep pretending otherwise, all you're going to do is get more of these people killed. And the side you claim to want to succeed will die and they will fail. And that's exactly where we are right now. And it's not just in the United States either. So here's the chief advisor for Zelensky. Just again, I think it's the same day as Keene, maybe a day later, but just a couple days ago. This is not something from months back or so. This is right now in the light of all that's failing in the Kursk operation, the collapsing front in the east, the failure of the 2023 offensive. In light of all of that, here's your senior advisor.
Russia can be forced through a proper military strategy, through military strikes, through increasing the cost of war for the Russian Federation. Increasing the cost of war means that the war will be fought on Russian territory.
Again, if all you do is look at that in isolation, you can see where okay, that's kind of plausible if you increase the pressure and the cost on the other side, but you can't. This is after 2.5 years of war have been fought, and you haven't done any of those things. And now then, that Gary showed at the beginning, Gary, if you can bring that back up, they're doing it now. So here's some operations that have been firing into Russian cities. You've got Belgorod that was attacked last night. That particular one there is Kharkiv. That's on the Russian side or the Ukraine side. So there also the people are starting to suffer. There was an attack in the city of Saratov a couple of days before this, to where a Ukrainian drone flew into a Russian apartment complex. That one right there. That's just an apartment building. So they're taking the war to Russia, and of course, with the Kursk offensive, they're doing that. What has that done? Does that have the preferred outcome? Has it caused Russia to go, oh, shoot, man, I didn't know that the war would cost us anything. Yeah, Putin in the war right away. You're oblivious. Anyone who says these things are oblivious to the fact that these strikes, all they do is make Russians madder. It makes the people more willing to support Russia and more willing to give Putin a free hand and say and demand that actually he win the war, not just seek a negotiated settlement. I mean, that's what happens to us. I mean, obviously that picture there, that tower being hit by a fixed wing aircraft certainly draws 9/11 comparisons. And I assure you, similar things are happening on the Russian side when they see those things broadcast throughout their country. So far from making them want to quit when they have the military advantages that I've described several times here, all it's going to make them do is press harder. And therein is your problem in a nutshell. The Ukraine side and the American side and all our enablers keep talking about tactical actions, ignoring strategy completely, while the Russian side, since 2022, since the initial operations into the war, recognized their huge mistakes and set about trying to correct them on the strategic side. And here's the problem. You see, when Russia is so big and has so many resources that it can absorb these losses and still over time win. So they made a big mistake in February 2022 with their capabilities and the resources that they had allocated to them. They made a big mistake in the Kharkiv area by having too few troops there and not putting any defenses in. They made a big mistake in biting off more than they could chew in the Kherson area. And they rectified all of those things. They traded space for time. They willingly said, we're going to take a whole year to just kind of hold what we got while we build something else out of contact here. And because they did that and they're not focused on what the 24-hour news cycle is today, now then they have the capacity to where they can impose their will here. So they stopped what you had in the Kherson in the Kursk offensive. That stopped, and it's now starting to reverse. And they never pulled their troops off of here. And because you put your troops in the Kursk offensive and didn't put them down here in the Pokrovsk, in the Kupiansk, in the Chasiv Yar area, the Toretsk area, all of these places are starting to fall at a much more rapid pace. And now then Ukraine is faced with a situation. Zelensky's waiting until September to go to President Biden and ask for more stuff. Dude, you got to worry about the next 24 hours here. What you need to do is take the troops that are in the Kursk area right now, get them out as fast as you can under order, solidify that border, because there's no guarantee that Russia won't continue pushing in that direction once you withdraw. So build up some border fortifications, move your troops back through it right now, get them in order, and then get as many of them as you can down to the Donbass area to stop that penetration there, simultaneously to seeking a negotiated settlement. I don't know if Russia would do it at this point. It's entirely plausible that that point is past. And certainly Russian officials said that with the incursion here, that all offers of negotiation are off the table. We'll see if they actually mean that. But if you want to even have a chance, that's where you need to go. You've got to solidify that defense right now before your forces break, because otherwise you could lose everybody in that Kursk salient, and you could lose everybody in the Western Front. And now all of a sudden it's a free fall. And we haven't seen that at any point in this war, but now all the conditions are lined up for it. And the farther we get down this path, the greater the chance that Ukraine outright loses this war militarily. And I can assure you that will cause political earthquakes of the first order. What is the U.S., the West, and NATO going to do if everything that we have done and all these claims, like what I showed you Keane saying, what Podolyak is saying, what Kirby is saying, what President Biden is saying now, Vice President Harris, all these people keep saying, proves to be illusory and failed, and we lost. What are we going to do then? Everything has always been about weakening Russia, but what if Russia ends up stronger and we end up not even the status quo, but weaker? And of course, then you got the real problems, and we'll discuss this on future episodes, that we could escalate out of fear, out of desperation, out of holy crap, we could lose, and we can't let that happen. So we're going to escalate, maybe bring in Western troops into Western Ukraine and to try to help them out. And now then you have the possibility of a literal war on a European level war that could possibly go nuclear. And now then it could be fought in Western territories. That would be the supreme strategic failure on our part. As bad as everything we've done now, it can get worse. And we better hope and pray that saner heads prevail and that somehow we're not going to take this to territories where it could go nuclear. That would be beyond destructive, and I dare not even think of that. But that's where we are right now, and that's what we could be facing very soon. Want to make sure you're aware of this. So take a deep breath, and let's share this video with anyone you can so that they at least know the truth. So like these pieces I've been writing all through here, I've got a record that I'm showing. Here's what's going to happen if you don't change. And so far, everything has come to pass. And again, I repeat, this is not bragging on myself and saying I'm some smart guy, only that I'm willing to look at things as they are. And I'm showing you right now, this is where we are. And if our leaders don't somehow sober up real quick, things could get a lot worse. But we'll see how it works out. Thanks for joining us today, especially on a Saturday. I appreciate your time.
Let's remind everybody that they can send this to their friends through any podcast that they listen to. So now that we're on Apple Tunes, we're on Spotify, we're on iHeartRadio. So anybody that doesn't want to watch a YouTube video can now listen to our podcasts.
Yeah, appreciate you reminding me of that, Gary. I was supposed to say that earlier, but I got focused on what was going on here. But yeah, to Gary's point there, that's kind of a new offering we have. We're really flooding the zone with this stuff. We want everybody to get the message. So anywhere you have podcasts, you want to listen to it while you're driving somewhere, you won't have to miss an episode. Thanks, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.